here we go. I have got my morning smoothie. I have got my laptop out. I'm sat ready and I'm starting a new book. This is The History of England, Volume 3, Civil War. Is this going to be like the Avengers? Probably not. But I'm ready to start learning about after the Tudor period. I think it starts with the Stuarts, right? And see what happens. So that was a really interesting first day. I just can't say it's as gripping as the volume 1 still. I mean, I only read 40 pages, but it was really good. The start of James Stuart's reign, the King of Scotland, now the King of England. We have like the introduction of the King James Version Bible, a lot more religious stuff. You know, he was a Protestant, getting rid of all the Catholics, all that kind of stuff. You have like the Guy Fawkes gunpowder plot. That was exciting. But really the thing that stood out today was that it just seems like James just wasted his money and all he wanted to do was party and hunt, and he didn't really care about anything else, and he just seems like a bit of a waste man in that sense. But anyway, that's day 1. You know what I learned today, guys? That during James's reign, the poor got poorer, the rich got richer, and the poor were really getting pissed off. Right, I'm not gonna lie, I didn't particularly enjoy my reading today. I felt like it was a really hard slog. It's just, I don't know, but it's a shame because I really enjoyed the first book, but the second and third haven't been as enjoyable. Maybe the history just hasn't caught me as much. His writing's still incredible. I think he tells history in an incredible way, but it's been hard. Anyway, what I learned today was that, you know, still most of the Tudor book and then the start of this book is still this whole Catholic versus Protestant. It's constantly going on, different things are happening, and King James just sounded like he just didn't have a clue what he was doing. He sounded like his head was all over the place, and you know, he wanted peace with Spain, whereas the rest of the population of England basically didn't. And then, to be honest, he just seemed like a rubbish king. And that towards the end of what I read today, he dies, and it just feels like, from what we understand, everyone was buzzing. Like, he was a mess. He was a moron. He was always ill, which, to be fair, probably isn't always his fault. But he just didn't have it together to be king and to rule. And so, James Stuart, R.I.P. Today, what I read, basically, Charles started his reign very poorly. Well, it sounds like most of his reign as king was pretty poor. He was like short, pompous, very up himself. He didn't take advice. He had a horrific relationship with Parliament, which was growing in strength and strength and strength. And he also tried to go to war against Spain, failed, against France, failed. It was just like, on a military sense, a disaster, a governing sense, a disaster, like infrastructure, the people around him, an absolute disaster. And then, yeah, this chasm starts appearing between him and Parliament, which, from what I understand, considering this book's called Civil War, it isn't going to end well. But it's a really interesting read. And one other little thing that I picked up is around this time in Charles' reign was when things like original idea of like newspapers and like news being relayed physically in paper form to people started appearing and becoming more and more common, especially throughout London. And like even like people's who've been writing down what happened in Parliament and that being relayed to the people. So more so than ever, the general population was starting to feel like the people in Parliament and not the king was representing them. So another day, another bit of reading about the build-up to civil war in England. And I think the things that stood out to me today was that Charles, again, he wants the divine right of kings. He wants absolute authority. He basically wants to regress England hundreds of years where the monarchy had absolute power, and the people just aren't having it. And he tried to impose stuff, especially on Scotland, a place where he really hasn't been since he was a kid, and he tried imposing English religion and law on them, like the Book of Common Prayer or Common Worship or whatever it is, and they just were not having it. And he led mistake and his team around him, the Archbishop of Canterbury, I think he's called Loud, they just make mistake after mistake after mistake, and there's The English are starting to get annoyed, but the Scottish are fuming. They actively start rebelling. They sign loads of stuff that basically saying Charles has no power there anymore, especially over religion, which is so key at this time. And they start rebelling. And the end of the chapter I just read is where the Scots are starting to gear up for war, the military getting their military ready, and I'm excited to see what's about to happen next. I don't know if you can see it, but I was just about to sit down and read, but then I suddenly noticed, can you see these like beautiful bits of silver like within the book, and like to make it, I think that looks sick, you know. I'm well impressed with that. How have I only just noticed? Oh my gosh, this book. King Charles, just a bit crap. I've said it so many times already. But the Scots are rebelling, invading England. Charles is trying to raise money through Parliament and other means, and the English as a whole having none of it. Obviously there are people that support Charles, they support his thing of the divine right of kings, but on the whole the English are just not having it. They have had enough, and it's brewing, it's getting ready, it's building. The Civil War is coming. Right, the Civil War, I'm just banging my chair. The Civil War has begun. I have had a fresh shave, and so far, from what I understand, on each side, or not each side, shared between them, there's about 100,000 troops involved, fed, trained, geared out. People were joining the ranks of each side purely because they were getting better food being within the army than outside of it. Obviously, there were still some people who actually cared about what was going on, but this is, a big civil war in terms of for England and the scale of it. And in the early days, early on, it feels like Charles and the royalists were gaining the upper hand. They were gaining the advantage. It feels like they were taking more and more of the major towns and cities and land and pushing the parliamentarians, or however you'd call them, back further and further into London. However, it feels like Oliver Cromwell's starting to take the spotlight a little bit. He's starting to raise his own army of elite troops, and I just have a feeling, from what I know, the little I know, that the tides are going to turn. However, it's exciting so far. So today I feel like I covered quite a lot of ground just in the 40 pages I read, and basically the Civil War was decided. The parliamentary army side rose up, they got some really key victories, and they basically ended up winning the Civil War, didn't they? And the king kind of got captured, kind of handed himself over, kind of walked into a trap. Hard to explain. But anyway, now he's basically in custody under house arrest, moving from place to place, and the army are deciding what to do with him. There was a bit of a argument between now the standing army and those who were originally in Parliament, but it seems like those in Parliament kind of gave in. And basically, Cromwell, his people, the army, as they're called in this, are now in charge. They've taken control of Parliament, they've got the king in custody, and they're just trying to work out, where do we go from here? We've won this civil war. What do we do now? Do we have a king? Who has power? How are decisions made? Who gets to have a say in this? It talks a little bit about voting and should people be allowed to vote and who gets to vote. And at this time, it's basically landholders. People who own land get to vote, not anyone else. And so it's not the general population yet. But it is really interesting. At times it was a bit hard to follow, but that's the basic gist of today. I literally just read my first sentence of the day, and I just want to read it out to you. So they're all trying to decide how this new government is going to form, what it's going to be like, who's going to be in charge. And he says, the commanders argued amongst themselves about the relative merits of monarchical, aristocratical, or democratical, I can't say these words, democracy government, but would come to no conclusion. At the end of the discussion, so this is the best bit, Cromwell, in one of those fits of boisterous or hysteria that punctuated his career threw a cushion at one of the protagonists, Edmund Ludlow. Before running downstairs, Ludlow pursued him and in turn pummeled him with a cushion. And so, in the middle of like this really important discussion about how they're going to form this new government, Cromwell just decides, let's start a flipping pillow fight, whacks someone, runs off, and then Ludlow pursues him and it's just the word pummel, then pummels him with a cushion. I think history can be funny. So it just seems to me that Cromwell started with really good intentions, right? He started from a good place, he didn't want a tyrant king, a king who wanted absolute power. He was a good leader of men and he was a good general by the sounds of it. And then as times went on, the power kind of corrupted him. Not kind of did. It almost definitely did. He felt like he was doing God's work, but really the power of his authority, his position as he kept getting stronger and stronger, was corrupting him more and more to the point where he almost became a tyrant himself. He disbanded the Commons and the Lords of Parliament and stuff. He was basically behind the execution of Charles. I mean, there were other people as well, but the execution of Charles at the end of the day wasn't something, by the sounds of it, that most people wanted. Although they were against him, they didn't want him killed, and Cromwell just kind of turned into a bit of a tyrant, and it sounds like a lot of England was trying to sort of rise up against him, but he also had a great network of spies and other people helping him stop those things. But it's interesting because, as I said, he started in a good place, and it feels like Cromwell turned into a bit of an evil guy by the end. So I feel like I read quite a lot today, although it's still only 40 pages. There was a lot of information in there. You had Cromwell not becoming king, although that was offered to him, but becoming Chief Magistrate and Lord Protector of the realm. Basically a king in all but title, which is interesting. And then he died, which was obviously sad, but also not. I think people were quite gassed about it. And it just kind of led to Charles II coming out of exile, coming back to England and taking the throne again in a kind of new order, which is part of what Cromwell did. He took the power away from the monarchy. The monarchy would never have complete power again, and that there was this level of everyone was responsible, everyone was under the law, which was obviously a really good thing. But Charles II came back, and the notable things I've read so far is he was kind of forced by Parliament to make Anglicanism the state religion. There was not going to be any more zealotry anymore from all these different groups. Anglicanism was the thing, that was the state religion. From then onwards, the Church of England's established, or had already been established, and that's what we kind of ended up till now as well, I guess. And then the only other thing that's quite funny is that Charles absolutely loved women. According to Peter Ackroyd, Charles had 17 mistresses, in which 13 of them he had illegitimate children. My man loved women. Just did a little bit of morning reading here on a Saturday in my dressing gown, as you can see. I look good. And today we're reading about basically little bits, ins and outs of the sort of late to mid 17th century, and some of the key things really were just the Great Fire of London, which destroyed apparently 5/6 of the city in terms of housing and everything, but literally by a year later it was pretty much all rebuilt in brick and stone. And so it was horrific, but they recovered pretty quick. And the second thing was just a little chapter on Isaac Newton and his just outrageous mind, his discovery and how he just propelled science forward. And so big up Sir Isaac Newton. So I kind of took a few days off reading this book, mainly because I've been really busy and my head's been really busy and I just haven't been able to sit down and concentrate on it. However, this morning I continued and just carrying on where, I've said it before, but Charles he seemed like he wasn't doing a great job. His dad didn't do a great job, and now Charles II isn't doing a great job. He's like made all these deals with the Dutch and then with the French, and like trying to betray them and just crossing it over. And at the end of the day, he's now basically, we're reading that he's being manipulated by King Louis of France. Like, he's asking for money constantly because he can't raise it in England because he's not allowed to just tax everyone anymore. And because he's asking for so much money, he has been manipulated. And so that's basically Charles. Though at the end of the chapter, he suddenly starts getting ill, and I'm wondering, is he about to die? However, the only other thing that really stood out that I really enjoyed is that they were saying that really people credit it to the 18th century, like the start of innovation, industrial revolution, changes and all that kind of stuff. But actually, when you look at it, really it was like the late 17th century is where it really started to begin with like the farming or agricultural revolution, and there were just hints of cities like Manchester and Birmingham and Sheffield growing, starting this industrial revolution. So I think it was really cool the way the Parliament had formed and the power of decision making it had. But the one thing that I still feel like at this point kind of sucked was the fact it was up to the king to like call and disband Parliament. It was up to him when it met and if it could make decisions. So there was still almost a lot of power in the king's hand, and that, yeah, I'm not a massive fan of that. But then we get Charles II dying, James II rising to the throne, and he was an idiot, right? He wanted to bring back Catholicism, he wanted to bring back absolute power and monarchy, and it did not last long, because before long, all the lords of England invited William of Orange, a Dutch guy, to come and claim the throne for the cause of Protestantism and just not being a douche. And so that's exactly what he did, and apparently that was called the Glorious Revolutions. And so that's where Civil War ends. We now have a Dutch king on our throne. And there we have it. I have finished book 3 of the History of England, and this one entitled Civil War by Peter Ackroyd. Now, yes, I will say overall I enjoyed it because these are really great books, and I can't say Ackroyd put a foot wrong in my opinion, but I will say I just didn't enjoy it as much as the first one. Like the Tudors one had the kind of same experience. Like I think the first book is totally like my areas of history, like sort of before the last 500 years. Well, I'm actually really interested. So all this stuff I've been learning in Civil War and the Tudor one, it's kind of pretty brand new. But that's on me, that's not on the book itself to enjoy it, if that makes sense. But I really did, I felt like I learned a lot. I've learned a lot about the Stuarts, and just like, again, it's this continuous, like almost religious war between like Catholicism and the Protestant faith and all these other little like sects of Christianity, which is pretty sad, to be honest. It's just constant, like it caused so much conflict. But it was a great read. I really enjoyed it. It took me 13 morning sessions to read this book, which is probably 1 or 2 more than I would have liked. But life has been a little bit crazy. I didn't fully apply myself at times to it and read as much as I wanted to. But 13 sessions of reading is pretty good, I think. And so overall, I'm continuing to learn about England. I'm continuing to learn about the history of this nation that I'm a part of, that I'm born into, that I'm from. And it's good to read. And it is an interesting ending. Like we talked in the first book about how so often Britain and England, or England specifically, seem to be colonised and conquered. And we end with this one with literally the nation inviting a Dutch ruler to come and be our king. Like, absolutely bizarre. But I guess that's the crazy history of England. And I'm really excited for the next one, reading it in a few weeks' time. All about revolution, innovation, starting that industrial revolution, and basically the main bit of the British Empire. And so, although that wasn't a great bit of history, it's definitely an interesting bit, and I'm so excited to read about it. So overall, I really enjoyed this book. Like I said, you have to apply yourself, you have to concentrate. Ackroyd, again, there's the way of writing and storytelling throughout is quality, and I really, really recommend it. Thanks so much for watching. I've been Ash Porter, and I'll see you next time.